Okay, so now I'm going to talk about some stuff to do with Auros. How it might have some kind of relationship to Haiku now, Haiku in the future, what their circumstances are, how much compatibility they have, kernel, all sorts of things, and the idea of the identity of an operating system. So I'm just going to boot into AROS here, or Icaros, the AROS distribution, and hopefully I'm going to be able to find the shell terminal, because if I could find that, I could kind of present some stuff and also just try to browse around a bit here. So this is all possible. Now this stuff over on the right I haven't been able to use, so I just leave it alone. They do have a terminal. Question is, how am I going to get to that terminal? Here it is. Alright, so the first thing you notice is not really necessarily the way it looks, because a terminal can look in any fashion. But here it's got AROS : system, and then this greater than sign. And so, you know, it's an Amiga, they call it an Amiga shell. Now the thing is with this, they don't really have your, there's something going on with the keyboard here. If I try to do PWD or LS or a lot of the classical Unix commands, they don't exist. So in general, I would be hard pressed as to how to set package source up on this. I think what get probably might be in here. Yeah, so what get is here. Could probably download it, but to bootstrap it, it would take a significant amount of changes. So there really isn't a full-fledged Unix compatibility layer the way they have it in Haiku. So this kind of makes it difficult. There isn't a tool set out there already that'll basically automate the process of downloading source code and allowing it to compile and be patched. A tool set that I know of. Now, there may be one. I just don't know about it. But it doesn't look like there is. And it doesn't look like it'd be easy to get the open source / Unix, almost synonymous set of tools in here, but they do have builds, right? So there's people that know how to do this, but I think they have to heavily patch this stuff, and I'm not quite sure where they keep their patches. The people that made Icarus said they were working on this for a number of months before they released it. Age of applications of the ones that are available, I wouldn't be able to tell that quickly. But it certainly is limited to SDL and terminal type of applications. We're coming to POSIX type stuff. Although it looks presentable when it comes up. It is clear that there are times when you try to run a program, it just doesn't work perfectly. And as these programs get newer in the open source world, and this is my opinion, the code tends to evolve and be more equipped for 64-bit stuff. You know, they're going to be doing, if they try to make it so it could build in both 32 and 64, you know, after a while they're going to start weaning off of the 32-bit stuff and going to 64. And a lot of these programs have unless they're just terminal-like programs, they're going to have the presumption that shared memory is going to be available, especially the graphical ones. At least I would think. So that would have to be worked around. So the people that are making this, I could tell they've done a tremendous job with the limitations that the system has as far as POSIX compatibility is concerned. On the other hand, it seems as though native Amiga apps need to run underneath the 64K limitation. So it seems that the future of this OS really would be in POSIX compatibility, but their file system layout isn't really POSIX-like. So it would take a while for someone that's come from a Unix environment to figure out, well, how do things get paths? How do you build stuff? They do have, if I can find it. It's not really clear to me about how you just browse around. Okay, here it is. So they do have an include directory. Yeah, and they have, it's hard to tell where I'm at. Headers, I think. They have a, there is a 64-bit header. There's kernel.h. They've been doing this for a long time. I mean, they have. So they're in a tough spot, in my opinion, because they want to be able to preserve the identity of the operating system. Yet I think they're stuck in a place where, unless you use the POSIX layer, I'm not quite clear on that. I don't see a lot of, let's see, are there any apps here that look like they're not 64K? The games seem to, let's see. They have GNU tools. And I'm telling you, in the world of alternative operating systems, thank God for the GNU project. I mean, the GNU project could have been draconian about GCC and forced everybody to accept the GNU General Public License if they want to use their compiler. And AROS would probably would have to. And they haven't. So they have there is some BSD-like agnostic attitudes in that world. But getting back to this, so this, let's see, DB render. I'm trying to find an app. That looks like a pretty okay, so this looks okay, maybe I'm okay. Let's assume this is not a POSIX app. So okay. So they could build both new and old stuff. But the apps that they're going to build is going to be isolated to their community. But it seems like they have more apps for their native platform than, say, Haiku. But I would say their development base is probably a lot smaller than what could be mustered between the NetBSD, the FreeBSD, and Linux communities combined, and OpenBSD communities combined, because they got POSIX and they're going to use that. And they're, morphed a little bit for the capabilities of a modern kernel, such as shared memory. This, I don't really know how things would get pathed or built. They probably do. Let's see. I wonder if GCC is working here. Don't know. So they certainly do have an environment which they could build things in. The environment certainly seems to be able to handle those things. I think that just for lack of manpower, to have a lot. And I could see it, given the maturity of the OS, I could see a commercial company being able to make apps for this. They would be able to test it, get it to work. It's just that the knowledge base, I think, isn't that big. That's really the only problem that they seem to have. They're a bit isolated and cut off from the POSIX apps that are out there. They're just made. They aren't the end-all, be-all, but they do solve an awful lot of problems. So, tax software, an office suite that everybody wants to use. It'd be nice to see Wine in here. It'd be nice to see, but I'm not sure, because it doesn't support shared memory. I'm not sure if Wine would run. The kernel seems to work a little better than Haiku's. I have to say that, in some regards. Except the system does feel a little bit choppy. Now, let's get back to the idea of identity of the operating system. Could AROS, or Icaros, if they wanted to, decide to use, say, the NetBSD kernel and keep the API in user space? It would probably be it'd probably take a lot of work to get the API to translate to the kernel, I would guess. In that regard, they're pretty much in the same spot, I would say, as Haiku. It's just the size of their community, but it's an old community, and the people that are there are, you better bet it's a good bet that they're very loyal to this, the idea of this. So it's more or less, to use this OS, it's more or less of an ideology that you like this layout more than practicality. The thing is, okay, let's look at the level of activity here. I guess I'll go right here. So looking at the status, they say they're pretty much overall 80 to 90% done, kind of like the way the Wine project is. I'm not sure what they mean by resources. And there's, in some cases, they don't really have whatever that is. But those things seem to be important, but I just don't know what they are. I actually just don't know enough to say. Theoretically, one would think they could boot and use a NetBSD kernel. I think the main... So the identity of the operating system, in my opinion, of any operating system, is the file system layout. how do things look when you go, you look around and you look at the directory structure. What does the terminal look like? And wallpaper, things like that. Icons can change. That's not really that big of a deal. For this to be used more in a mainstream fashion, it just needs more people, I think. And it does. I hate to say, even though this looks better than the last one, it's got this gnomish looking icon. I don't like the gnome icons at all. Now there may be a way to change that. Things seem to be also kind of too far split apart. So, what's the difference between appearance and theme? Guess I gotta restart. Okay, so I got a purple theme, but I gotta restart. How would I change icons if I wanted to? Why is there a frying pan down here? What does it do? Oh, okay, so that burns CDs. They can burn CDs. They do use ELF. But these just seem to be kind of different. That's part of the, I would say that is part of the identity of the OS. In general, I mean, this leaves much to be desired compared to Haiku's layout. The colors just don't seem to work all that well, but it's all an artistic thing. Okay, that could be worked on, right? Not a big deal. Something could be done about that. There could be some guy comes in, does some artwork, and fixes this stuff up. But they're kind of stuck in their own world. They're not going to be able to use POSIX. And if they went and they put POSIX in here, they would have, it would change, in my belief, it would change the identity of the operating system. I think a lot of the native apps wouldn't work anymore. Say, well, okay. And then that just raises the question of why use this OS? And why does that raise that question? Well, it raises the question because there are Amiga emulators out there that are available. It's not exactly easy to set it up in Linux. In fact, I haven't really been able to figure that out myself. But there is a full emulation environment, and I would probably, and so that would, allow you to run. It has to be set up like a virtual machine, but it's specific to the Amiga, and here I have a virtual machine anyway. But that virtual machine would use the Linux kernel. It doesn't really use the AROS kernel, and I'd still have my POSIX layer. I'd still have all my apps, but it'd be integrated more so than in a VirtualBox environment. And the applications that they offer don't really seem that appealing, at least so far. It's kind of like that. If the kernel were improved to have shared memory, we're talking about a lot of kernel work once again. and then and then maybe some kind of second POSIX shell that would be available. So what I would do if I were them, I would use a NetBSD kernel. I'd translate the API, or FreeBSD, or I'd probably use a Linux kernel because of the hardware support, and I'd just make sure that, because they're using emulation anyway, so I would still use emulation in the environment, and it'd be down really to working on the API. And then the bonus would be you'd have shared memory and have hardware support, better hardware support. That's the same story with Haiku, but this community here is, well, reading back to 1993. It didn't, that's a good 10 years more of time than Haiku. So you can imagine in 10 years time Haiku's still going to look the way it does. So in 10 years time we're going to say, okay, I would imagine that the user environment is going to be good. The ABI compatibility with the original BOS is going to be better than this. Hopefully by that time we would have worked out a way to, in 10 years time, to connect to a Samba share, and hopefully in 10 years time we would be able to support the hardware that's out in 10 years. In fact, I don't know how good AROS actually does with bare metal. They may need to have a hardware list. They don't have a place like Haiku-Where, but they do have the Amiga archives, which is kind of like Haiku-Where. But the question is, would we want to be in this situation in 10 years from now? At least from the Haiku community's point of view. That is to say, still where we are now in 10 years' time, but with less hardware support. Now, 5 years, 10 years, unless we're doing kernel work, my guess is that there's going to be less and less actual metal that we're going to be able to run in. We're already kind of seeing the deterioration of the ability to run in metal go away as people buy new computers. There's more complaints about that. It just all has to do with, and Haiku doesn't really have that identity problem. There's a big difference between when you open up the terminal. I wouldn't say it's a problem, issue, it's just question to deal with, right? And then I'll also talk about the level of agnosticism of the so it says AROS system. Am I in the system directory? Is there a change directory? No. I mean, there probably is a way to change directories, but you can't just plonk down a package source and start building. You may or may not be able to plonk down some source code and start building, but maybe not in the same fashion. You may have to make a lot of changes to the source code just to build your basic app and keep your patches set aside. When the new version comes out, test them and tweak them for the new version and stay on it, because the upstream projects aren't really accepting patches from Amiga. Some are, some aren't, or they're not being submitted, or AROS in this case. So if AROS were to get rid of the shell that looks like this, where it's got a 1-point AROS colon system and has none of the Unix stuff in it, and it just suddenly just change and all of a sudden have a completely different shell with command line tools that work completely differently, than your traditional Unix, then that I would say that would invade upon the identity of the operating system. So I would never say they should get rid of that Amiga shell. That's so different that it is part of the identity of the operating system. What makes it different, what makes it better. But when you already have a POSIX shell, making sure that your end users could path their stuff isn't really going to cause an identity crisis, or symlinking a few libraries isn't really going to cause an identity crisis when you actually offer a POSIX layer. It would be to offer a POSIX layer in the place of the Amiga shell would be an identity crisis kind of thing for this operating system. However, I think that an Amiga shell would probably still be able to run in a NetBSD system. Basically, they could move this into emulation, basically. And they wouldn't really lose their... And conversely, they could just have it boot into Wanderer here, have the NetBSD kernel on the back. They could have a shell for the Amiga shell, and they could also have the POSIX shell, which will allow them to grow and have more people use their OS. Bring things like Firefox and LibreOffice and things that the users would probably want to use, I would say. But they would still have their own API. But they'd be maintaining two of them. Not really, actually. Because they would just pick another OS and just use that and follow it. Whether it's NetBSD, FreeBSD, or Linux, that would be there. It wouldn't be a dual boot kind of thing. It would be just a shell question of what shell you use. And I would say that this community could grow and do a lot. And they have a lot of knowledgeable people that probably could pull that off. That's just my opinion. They've been around for a long time. They've been working on this thing for 20 years. Now, the level of change taking place, the number of users and the funding, my heart really goes out to this group. So, you can see there are people that are working on whatever classes are. But there are parts of this that haven't been worked on since 2008, 2009. They're not done. Just no one's working on it. I mean, at all. As far as I can tell, at least according to it looks that way. That, you know. So, and I don't know if it would be easier or harder if they used a different kernel. But it certainly is something to ask. Now, let's get back to the attitude of the project. The attitude of the project is that they're just gonna do this stuff. That's what the project's here for, and they're here to release a basic system. That's it. And people can do whatever the hell they want with the rest of it. These questions that I bring up about AROS really wouldn't be AROS questions, I think. They would say, well, if you want to have a POSIX layer and you want to use a NetBSD kernel, do that with your distribution, perhaps. But at the end of the day, though, that really muddies things up. Because these are all kernel calls, and all this group really does is work on the kernel and some minor, user space stuff. It almost sounds like if it's a completely different project, to go into emulation somewhere else. This group is pretty agnostic. They don't think that if Icarus has to reboot after improperly exiting the Commodore emulator doesn't reflect poorly on them. You know, it's just they realize that their kernel has certain, you know, it's the way it is. They just don't really, they try to stay out of it. They don't want to argue. They've had in the past some kind of okay, with the demise of Amiga, it seemed feasible to acquire. Until this happened, the scope of the intended work to be determined more precisely, which were what would be the best way to fix them, what were the features so-called modern OS had to have, and how would they be implemented in the Amiga. For the Amiga. 2 years later, people start arguing the sources had not been acquired yet, not a single line of code had been added to them. Discussion and often repeating previous discussions, returning to mere claims that things weren't impossible. The winter of '85, who had set up, fed up with the situation, posted look for minimal common ground. Several options were given. Conclusion was that almost anyone would like to see an Amiga OS with a compatible Amiga OS 3.1. So now they're just seeing if they can do it. They're not going to argue about whether it's impossible. It's just if they can. But that's what they agreed on. It does solve, you know, people will have an Amiga like OS to work with. Let's just look at also, let's see. They have this thing called Power to the People, where they fund stuff, and this is where my heart really goes out to these people. So they have some, they do have bounties, and they are so there's $208 pledged towards porting cups to Auros. And you know, my heart really does go out to these. I mean, he's going to give $2. He's going to give $2. I mean, these people are dedicated. They may not be wealthy, but they do care. So there we are. QT5, they're talking about it. So far, that seems to be a big item. But there's only so much a small community can do. These are people that love their hardware. They love the nostalgia of it. They love what this used to do. And you just wish there would be more people behind it. And I think they could have a lot of this stuff. But unfortunately, they may have to give up the kernel. I mean, the API is what they're trying to re-implement. And with emulation, that's just the way I see it. And NetBSD, you know, runs on a lot of platforms. Right now, they have 2 projects going. They got MorphOS and AROS. And, you know, getting that API into a kernel would probably take some work, but if they can get that patched in, and it does show some promise. You know, the reason why I do this is I want to see more than just 1 or 2 operating systems that can run on computers. People have a choice. It's not only good for, it's good for business. It's good for national security. You know, if there's only one platform to target, you get things like, you know, crypto locker and, you know, stuff like that. Free software tends to liberate people. It does allow for more options. It's just there's not really enough money behind it. And the way people donate. You know, but if I look, you know, looking at this, I mean, the guy that paid $100 for the chance that QT might get ported, that's pretty good. I mean, that's more than what the Amiga OS sells for. We need, like, almost everybody in any community, whether it be Linux, whether it be, and Linux has just so much saturation in it. I'm almost surprised that we as Linux users, we could almost say, okay, this is what we have to do. If there was some godfather of Linux that could speak out and say, okay, I want everybody to go out and make a tax application, it could be done, or whatever. But now, as more things are becoming more web-based, the user space apps are becoming less important. What's really is important is to have a really good browser. So, power to people. What they want to do is they want to get more drivers, a package manager, and there's been some people that have been very, now this web browser, they put a lot of money into it. That's that one with the timer, and can't even go to the YouTube web page. But they have. I mean, they're coming up with money, and the way things have to be built, just to go over this more, they actually, for developers here, they say to port apps, they flat out suggest you cross compile. So, that being the case, it's kind of like, I think the people that are working on the AROS kernel should just find some more mature kernel, whether it be FreeBSD, NetBSD, or Linux, a group that's going to be willing to accept their APIs. And get it merged into that kernel that has a larger group and saturation. To my mind, it's got to be Linux or NetBSD, because those have a lot of cross support. But and I really don't think it would actually be impossible to get a different X Windows system besides X to run in Linux or NetBSD. Again, there is the separation between the kernel. But one thing about Haiku is, you wouldn't want it to be in 10 years where it's only going to run in a virtual machine or only going to run an emulation somewhere else. And right now, Haiku's in a very good position if it would just revert what it did to close the doors on outside developers. If too much time goes by, it's not going to go anywhere. We have the luxury of having our own kernel and a full POSIX layer. That's quite an accomplishment. But still, new versions of GCC will come out, over time. So that in itself requires work, and there's no sense in doing a lot of work on getting stuff ported, such major stuff like Qt or GCC, if we're going to lose it eventually because we've broken our ability to build things. It's really that simple. If you compare it to AROS, you can't just say, well, we're in a better shape, so we must have done the right thing. Well, it just has to do, a lot of it has to do with history. And frankly, it would be nice to see AROS mature. I think it would take the kernel area to get shared memory, to get an independent POSIX layer. But you ask yourself, did we really need to use that particular kernel? So that's my opinion on that. I wouldn't want to see the OS lose its identity. So I would. And the thing is it's hard to tell how that directory structure actually looks. I don't know whether AROS has the same kinds of files. I mean, they're folders and they're files, but let's take a look at this. What I'm struggling with here is if we add a POSIX layer that needs to have directories and files, and this has something else that aren't exactly the same. What I'm proposing may be actually impossible. The Symbian writer looks okay. The printing support is not good. And they're going straight to cups. This is what they want. You got mPlayer. What's Dopus? But it's really kind of hard to move around here. I don't know. It seems that at some point I was okay, so this looks like it's some kind of what's this? No idea what that does. This looks like I'm browsing around. Okay, so to look at the system here. I don't know what assign means. It looks like they have directories and files. All you really need is just a POSIX shell, just like Haiku. And if they have that, and they enhance their kernel, or they move to a kernel that is enhanced and can accept the APIs, which I don't know how the hell hard that would be. I think they can keep the identity of their OS. Which is going to be very important, I think. So the trick is not to lose the identity of the operating system, but be able to move along. And really, honestly, the open source world has pretty much decided they're going to put the energy is going to go into Linux. The other kernels are really playing catch up. FreeBSD was surpassed, NetBSD was surpassed a while back. Driver support's there. I wouldn't argue that FreeBSD and NetBSD ought to go to Linux, but it would be nice to have them all, everybody working on the same thing. All right, so those are my comments. And how does it relate to Haiku? It just, if it gets to the point there may be some other technology that comes out that's akin to shared memory. We need to have, I mean, in my opinion, for an operating system to be able to survive very well, it needs to have active development in the kernel area, like all the time. Just constantly. There's no reason why there wouldn't be. I mean, it's not that there isn't a reason, but not having activity in kernel land that's about as active as the Linux kernel is just an indication that not as much stuff as features are being added to the system, right? At the end of the day, truth be told, on an operating system, server versus desktop doesn't matter, because the shared memory, these desktop apps want shared memory, the same kind of shared memory a server app wants. If the system isn't going to be a good desktop, it's not going to. I'm talking about Haiku now. If it's not going to be a good server, it's not going to be a good desktop. It's not going to be a good desktop. It's not going to be a good server. I don't know if there are any limitations to this file system. I don't know what file system they use, actually. It does have a chance right now. It just isn't viable. It'd have to have a lot of money placed into it. A lot of developers move over to it for it to be viable. And a thriving commercial community based on a user base that's pretty large. Unfortunately, it's not there, so that's my opinion of the situation. I wish it was better. I'm not against it, or any of these OSs, actually. I'm all for them. And I wouldn't want to see the identity of these unique platforms to be lost, but I would want them to actually be able to keep up with technology and to be able to offer the same apps that are available on other apps, especially since the source is open. So that's my thing. My heart really goes out to these people. But it is a very sophisticated group. I mean, we got a RAM disk here, which to me is just a quick and easy way to get to the to get stuff off the clipboard, and maybe to have a quick way to actually browse around the file system. But as you can see, things don't really always work all that well. Like some things close, some things don't. I wish the best for the group. Right now, it really isn't viable, and it's not just because of apps. It's because of some kernel limitations. I would say that's the same thing with Haiku, unfortunately. But I do say that Haiku has a better feel to it. But this doesn't. The Haiku doesn't have like the ability to connect to a server. It's got the file system limitations, and it's been artificially broken. The ability to build stuff, and here it's which should be easy to fix. Here it would take a major effort to get POSIX in here, which would be another problem. So they're stuck in their own environment, and without the main thing is the saturation of people wanting to use the system. But there are too many other good alternatives out there, unfortunately, and it's just too difficult to get the same thing to build in this environment as in the other ones, and so less people try, and other people that do try, they're very skilled and they're very committed. But in some things you can have bounties, $1 million bounty for QT, but if it's impossible, it's impossible. Some of those things I think would literally take a very large company to do. And the way things are broken in Haiku, especially with the shared memory, we need developers to get the kernel up to speed with the hardware. It would take a large, very, very large influx of money. We're not getting enough in there. And I think just like this community, the Haiku community is committed to putting money in it, but we literally would not have enough money to pay everybody to do everything that needs to happen. And so we might as well, my opinion is, with most of these things, is just use another kernel. Now, everybody's afraid of what happened to Syllable. Oh, okay, well, that was we made a Syllable server, so that was a real... We blinked, it's like Coke versus Pepsi. Coke blinked, and they changed their formula. But it's the identity of the operating system that you want to preserve. Okay, I've rambled on long enough.